Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 32 of The Kill File. First off, I want to shout out the listeners who have just joined us. Welcome. I hope that you will keep on coming back. And to those of you who are continuing to spread the word for The Kill File, thank you so very much. You guys are the absolute best, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. If you weren't here to listen, I wouldn't be here to share. Also, I wanted to mention again that I will be doing some sort of merch giveaway at some point. I just got to figure out how I want to do that and where people can join in on the fun, and hopefully that will be a part of The Kill File, that we can do this every few months so that we can get some of the merch out there for all of us to enjoy. So with that said, if you guys want to take a look at the merch website on thekillfile.com, click shop merch and let me know your thoughts on what you would want as a giveaway. There's so much on there, not just clothes, although the clothes are so much fun, but there's many other items as well. Don't forget when you look that there's 2 pages of merch, so be sure to check out that second page as well. And let me know on social media or in an email what you guys would want to see in a giveaway. Okay, that's it for business. Let's get to today's episode. We are going to cover the case of Earle Nelson, aka the Dark Strangler, aka the Gorilla Killer. So this will be a 2-parter, as there was just a wealth of information on this case and so many victims that I just had to split it into 2 episodes. First off, let me shout out the book that I read that got me into this case, as well as some of the information that will come from it. A book by Ryan Green, but also just for the pure fact that I am not a huge book reader, like for pleasure, I never really have been, but for you guys and for the podcast, I do read books and of course articles, thousands of articles and websites. But you guys, this book was just wow. Not just the book, but the writer. I'm obsessed. The book that I read for this episode is called Gorilla Killer, a true story of betrayal, brutality, and butchery, and it was absolutely amazing. A good read, easy to read, but also had plenty of words that I didn't know and had to research. Highly suggest you check out that author. I ordered some more books from him, and I cannot wait to get started for new episodes. Trigger warnings for today are going to be murder, rape, necrophilia, and brutality. Let's jump in. Earle Nelson was born to parents Francis Nelson and James Farrell on May 12, 1897. Let's first talk a little bit about Earle's parents, just so we can get a sense of where he came from and what he was already working with when it comes to his genes. So Francis's father absolutely did not approve of James from the get-go. He did not want his daughter Frances to be involved with a Spanish immigrant in the least. But because Frances ended up pregnant, they were married in what was said to be a shotgun wedding. For any of you who don't know what that means, because recently I was told, I can't remember who it was, but that they didn't know what that meant. It's an old joke, and I guess that you would say where like a woman would get pregnant, and then the man was forced to marry her because the father would jokingly force the man down the aisle with a shotgun and force him into marrying his daughter. It's like a hurried wedding, or basically a forced wedding due to a pregnancy, so that's what that means, and that's where that comes from. However, as romantic as this sounds, the pair was anything but made for each other. It was said their honeymoon was spent with James finding other women when he was taking a break from hitting his wife Frances for turning down his very non-romantic, lustful efforts. Frances's family, mainly her mother, was a religious radical that we will definitely get into soon, but needless to say, Frances was the black sheep of her family in the fact that she was not a religious person and drank her sorrows away instead of asking for any type of forgiveness from anyone or any entity. Frances and James's apartment was described as being disgusting and filthy, but it was just a place to rest their heads as James made money to pay the bills and Frances made a sad and poor attempt at being a housewife. When Frances barely made it to the hospital to give birth, she actually passed out from the pain when she arrived. The midwife who would help deliver Earle saw that Earle's head was coming through what he was about to be born from, which was an opening full of warts, sores that were leaking fluid, and syphilis. If that doesn't make you want to wear a condom, I don't know what would. It was said that Frances's syphilis was considered to be in the advanced stages as she had sores on her hands and her feet and a terrible fever. This could be passed to the child Earle during birth or even during breastfeeding. So for this reason, Earle was taken from Frances immediately, And when James found out about her condition, he was not surprised, as apparently he had had syphilis before Frances even got pregnant. Sad. James was said to have held his new baby the day that he was born, but thought Earle was the ugliest little thing that he had ever seen. I had no idea what to do with a baby. James was less than thrilled and barely listened to what he had to do when it came to bottle feeding the baby and had absolutely no interest in it. When they got home, Frances was left in charge of all the childcare as James didn't want to be bothered with any of it. Since he too had a bad case of syphilis and his palms were too sore, James knew that he may not have a lot of time left and wanted to live his life wild and free as much as he could before his time came. Mothering did not come easily to Frances, as the money or the allowance that James would give her forced her to use some of her drinking money on Earle's formula. Earle cried all the time, to which Frances would try to cover his mouth with her hand, which would make him cry even more. Frances had thoughts of just smothering the baby, but would never do it and would shake the thoughts, knowing that as she became increasingly sick, that something was seriously wrong with her. The doctors had tried to explain to Frances what she had and tried to give her medicine for her illness, but she was getting worse. She was said to be constantly in a stage of hotness, so like hot flashes to the extreme. And this kept the windows open all the time, but she did try to wrap up Earle or swaddle him to keep him warm, and tried to keep out some of the rain that was coming through the windows. Frances had failed to realize that James had stopped coming back altogether. He had died from his own infection as the illness raced through his body. It attacked his mind until he attempted to drown it all out with alcohol. Some sources said that Frances died first, and others said James. As more said James, I'm going to go with that. Unfortunately, following her husband's death, Frances too would die in their disgusting, grimy apartment, as her illness was gnawing at her flesh that covered her face. It was said towards the end that her nose was almost completely gone, as Earle was about 6 months old when his mother died, spread eagle, on the floor. It was Earle's wailing that finally allowed the landlord to come seeking and unlocking the door, as she never answered it due to being so behind on the rent. He found Earle screaming, not having been held or coddled for days, until a face that would seem friendly came in to get him, and this would be his grandmother, whom he had never seen, Frances's mother, Jenny Nelson. Jenny would go on to adopt Earle and her family, as she already had a daughter and a son still at home. Lillian was just 8 years old, and Willis was just 10 years old. Jenny's older children, who no longer lived in the home, had nothing to say about the adoption. Because they were no longer living with her, they didn't feel it was their place to say anything. It was said that Jenny's household was run with very strict structure, and their lives were entirely revolving around their devotional faith and devotion to the quote-unquote Pentecostal church. Okay, so I had to look this up to see what the difference between this and Christianity was, because in Earle's story, and this is important, and this is something that's going to come up a lot, it was also said a lot in the book, of just how devout and deep Jenny's family was into this kind of religion or church. And me being so non-religious, I wanted to know the difference. From what I could find, Pentecostalism is a form of Christian faith that actually had a huge emphasis on things like the Holy Spirit of it all, and is also based off different direct experiences of the presence of God by the believer of the faith. Pentecostals are said to believe that much of their faith needs to come from experience and not just from thinking or the rituals of church. So they believe, I guess, in what they call gifts from their Holy Spirit. For example, supernatural healing, speaking in tongues, glossolalia, which is like speaking in a language that's not known for the purposes of religious worship. And then, of course, manifestations of the Holy Spirit. From what I have read, Pentecostalism is the most successful Protestant domination in the world today, and this is according to the museyprotestant.org. So I think I've actually been to one of these churches when I was younger. I remember spending the night at a friend's house, and I don't remember if it was that evening or the next day, but I remember them taking me to this church, and this scared the shit out of me. I remember people going on stage and this man putting his hand to their head and them like falling over. The church was huge, like hundreds and hundreds of people. And the thing that I distinctly remember the most was this lady who was sitting by us. And I remember that I was only like 10 years old at this time. This lady was like looking to me like she was having some sort of seizure, but it was very weirdly controlled. And I distinctly remember her kind of seeming like she was drunk, but she wasn't. At least I don't think so. And she was making like moaning noises and laughing with her eyes closed. Not like in a sexual way, but like creepy as fuck, as the moaning came like before the giggles. It scared the piss out of me, and I have no idea what was going on in this place. And it was all confusing for me and scary and packed full of people who were all having their own experiences. I guess I was just sitting there like shell-shocked and wondering why I was the only person who wasn't having some profound emotional response to the music and the teachings that were happening. It was very different than the Catholic Church that I had grown up going to, with the kneeling and the boring songs. Anyways, if you guys are Pentecostal or have any experiences with these churches or religions, I would love to know your story. Truly, I am fascinated with people's beliefs. They are all so different than my own atheism. So I would love to know what you've been through with those religions or any of the experiences that you have. So you will see why this story of Earle Nelson and his start of life, as we are about to delve into, is extremely fascinating to me. It's different than anything I've ever known. Also, I apologize if I butchered any of the explanation. I did my best to research into the religions and subjects, but because they're foreign to me, I can only get what I can get from the research. I never mean any offense. So, Jenny takes in Earle. They are devout to the Pentecostal church and beliefs. Basically, they are what we would consider to be extreme religion practices. In the house, they kept a Puritan extremist structure, so there was no entertainment or any indulgences of any kind allowed within the home or in their lives for that matter. At least not without guilt attached. Jenny's thought was that if the children needed to read, then they would read the quote-unquote Word of God. And if the children wanted to run and play, then they had the amount of energy that Jenny felt that they should use on cleaning or doing chores or tending to the garden. Frances was said to have rebelled in the way that she did with the force that she did because of the structured lifestyle with no shenanigans allowed. Jenny believed in only the sinful and only the righteous. There were no other options. Earle was spoke of from early on, growing up with his cousins, as a beast of sorts, and Lillian and Willis were also known to have spoke of Earle as feral. Since Earle couldn't really walk when he first came to Jenny's house, and even as he did start to grow up, Earle would walk around on all fours instead of standing upright and walking normal. He had terrible table manners in which he was caned almost nightly for. Yes, caned, as in beat with a cane. I guess the rest of the kids ate with acceptable table manners, but Earle did not. According to his biographer Harold Schechter, Earle was fond of olive oil when it came to his meals, and after he would douse his food with the oil, he basically sucked down the food, having hardly chewed it, as fast as humanly possible. Because of his mannerisms, the sounds of his screeches from the caning became somewhat of a normal occurrence, but Earle didn't put forth any effort to change himself. The other kids teased him and called him an animal, which his table manners did nothing to deter. It was said that before Earle was even able to read in general, he was able to recite the entire Bible from memory. Luckily, by the age of 10, Earle's quote-unquote older brother and sister were starting to grow fond of this feral child as they started to grow older and starting their own lives. I guess it gave the older siblings some reprieve from living a boring life that was so structured with strict rules when Earle was said to lumber on all fours, and he was also quite entertaining to the other children as his behavior was so odd. This would leave the older siblings with some fondness as he was so entertaining and obviously so much different than the rest. You could probably guess that Earle didn't do very well in school. He was a loner, isolating himself from friends or any school staff with all of his Bible talk and with what was considered morbid behavior from the start. When Jenny would dress Earle for school, he would be nicely set out in the morning with nice clothes, but when he would return, his clothes were destroyed. And of course, he was beat for this, but Earle lacked the understanding of why he was even in trouble. Although Earle was clearly obsessed with the Word of God, he never seemed to quite follow the rules of the 10 Commandments himself, and of course this would get him into trouble at school, which he would eventually be expelled from, as the school felt that he was too difficult to handle. As it was said, Earle had no fear of death, as he believed that he would just end up in the kingdom of God, and things that were considered play for him were things that would make other children quake in their boots. He played rough, as he would wrestle with others and essentially bite them. He was known to play chicken with trains coming at him, but because he was so agile, he would jump out of the way just in the nick of time. I picture like Tarzan, but scarier. Despite his wild nature, Earle did try very hard to be a quote-unquote good boy for Jenny, never having asked for anything, and was only handed things down from his older brother type figure. Because of Jenny's lack of realizing that Earle needed things that the other kids enjoyed, it was the older sibling Willis who would hand his bicycle down to his poor little cousin brother who was often forgotten. Not on purpose, he was still a child who needed childlike things. The bicycle would forever change Earle's life, and not for the better. It would be when Earle was around 11 years old, when his older brother or uncle would have handed him down the bike. Earle was so very excited to receive such a gift that he worked on learning the basics of writing immediately, and he also felt the need to show off the first thing that Earle felt he had ever truly owned on his own. Earle was known to race up and down the streets with such force and speed that people would stop and gasp, probably worried that this child would be hurt without anyone concerning themselves for him. And this is indeed what would happen. Before too long, Earle started doing tricks alongside his need for speed, and unfortunately for Jenny, Earle had forgotten her lessons on humbleness, as she knew that he would eventually make a fool of himself, even though she constantly tried to read him the passages about pride, coming before the fall, trying to get across that an accident would happen. While Earle was said to be speeding down the street, his wheel got stuck in some trolley tracks, to where he slowed down just enough that when the trolley itself came around the corner, it hit him horrifically in the head. His bike was crumpled like a piece of paper as everyone on the trolley got off to see if the child was all right. He was not all right. In fact, a hole was somehow punched into the side of his face, essentially in his temple, by a piece of the trolley. Earle's eyes were still open, but as he was trying to speak, no one could understand him. He was almost said to be talking in tongues as he was spasming and tweaking and jerking about. Horrific. At this point, some of the kids who Earle had been showing off for took him back to his grandmother's house. Jenny looked at Earle with despise as he peed himself, unable to control his bowels in that moment. She knew that this moment would come with all of Earle's foolishness on that bike, and she was not surprised. Unfortunately for Earle, all that Jenny would do was take off his clothing and clean up his body, and then put him into bed, where Earle would remain for 6 days. We have heard things before, and we will hear it again, that they're starting to link head trauma with many killers, let alone serial killers, and this would be no different. Feel bad for the child of Earle, but not the adult. He will go on to become one of the most horrific serial killers I have ever heard of. When Earle arose from what was probably a 6-day coma of sorts, he was almost dead of dehydration and malnourishment. But before the poor boy was even allowed to get water or food, he was sent outside to be cleaned by the freezing water inside of the pump. No one knew how deep the injury to his temple was, but there was skin starting to grow back, and there was an indent that would be there for the rest of his life. He couldn't really remember what had happened to him, but he was complaining of horrible pain where he was hit. However, Jenny thought this to just be part of his injury. It would be clear that Earle had gaps in his memory as he tried to go to school the next day, but was reminded that he had been expelled for being what the main teacher described as psychotic, and this had happened 3 years earlier, yet Earle did not remember. It was also said at the time that he would start to masturbate in a compulsive nature with the inability to control himself in the least. Jenny always tried to catch him in the act so that she could properly shame him, but this new Earle was clever and cunning, and no longer cared or trusted blindly as he had done before in Jenny. She had started to think that the accident caused Earle to lose the Lord right out of his twisted little head. If Earle had been able to stop at just the masturbation, it was said that Jenny may have just left it alone after some time, but unfortunately this would continue to grow. Jenny caught Earle one night lingering in the hall, which she didn't think much of at first because he was known to keep weird hours getting snacks and meandering the halls, but this was different. He just stood there, fidgeting, but trying not to be caught, lingering outside of Lillian's room. When Earle heard his grandmother move after a while of watching him stand there, he fell to all fours and ran into his room. Quite literally, the beast. Turns out, Lillian's top half was bare as she was getting into her pajamas and brushing her hair, and when Jenny realized this, she shut the door angrily. At this, Earle had become a peeping Tom. And as we all know, or maybe you don't, but peeping Toms don't usually just stay peeping Toms. They almost always escalate to other offenses. Bright lights would affect Earle now that he had a head injury and his head burned all of the time. He preferred the darkness and had become even weirder now, mumbling to himself and to what seemed like people who were not there. And always was the mumbling and gibberish circling around the Lord, and in fact, most of them were just recitations of the Bible. At the time, Jenny thought that Earle's lust for girls had subsided, and apparently he became so good at hiding his constant masturbation that Jenny felt relieved, until she started to realize that one night after she was changing for bed, that her once closed door was now slightly open, again and again. This was said to have made Jenny feel sick to her stomach to think of her grandson, the nasty little beast, quote-unquote, manhandling himself after watching her get undressed. At this, she started to carry a key around and locked the doors and the bathroom anytime she was in it. And this would prove to be part of the reason for her death. Earle would be 14 years old when his grandmother passed away, having slipped in the bathtub and not wanting to call out for help. And because of laying there naked for hours in a cold tub, she ended up with pneumonia that would eventually kill her. After the death of Jenny, Earle was absolutely not ready to take care of himself, and everyone in the family knew it. He just didn't have enough basic understanding of how to live on his own without help. And with his gibberish and constant fainting that he now endured due to his injury, no one wanted to take him in. Lillian felt sorry for Earle, the young little weird kid that no one wanted, and he came to stay with her, still in his clothes from the funeral because no one had told him to change his clothes. It was said in an interview later from Aunt Lillian that, quote, he was just like a child, and we considered him like a child, and of course, we would never go too far with him because there was always the fear of him, end quote. Seemingly suggesting that everyone around Earle knew that there was something wrong with him, but not knowing how deep that ran. I guess as he was entering Lillian's home, he actually fainted, as he was known to do, and when he came up, he was walking on all fours. This caused Lillian to giggle and realize that the boy that she had admired, who now seemed miserable from the rule of Jenny, was still inside him somewhere. Lillian's husband was, however, not fond of Earle. Earle was known to have conversations with people who weren't really there and was always rambling to himself. Lillian didn't really ask where her nephew was running off to all the time, as he was hardly ever at home. He would roam the streets on his own, feeling like that he could be himself, and no one was there to judge him. He would sometimes sleep in what he thought were abandoned cabins on the outskirts of San Francisco, where they lived, and he seemed to be, for the most part, invisible to others. As Earle was said to hear voices that spoke to him, his grandmother had told him that they were demons, and that they were just trying to tempt him. Now, without all of the people around him, he could hear them more clearly. He was still a compulsive masturbator, but now there was no one to tell him that it was wrong, or to shame him about it. The visions of his Aunt Lillian and Jenny in his head, in the state of undress, still taunted his brain, and of course, Lillian didn't know this. Not exactly knowing much about his own growing body, Earle was becoming a full man, full of hair on his body as his muscles grew and he became very tall. None of which seemed to come to his attention, as he only cleaned himself as he was taught by Jenny, and that was that. The fact that Earle was known for dressing in all black, muttering Bible verses, and was a seemingly huge, nice guy at the time, he actually became a favorite of some local sex workers, as it was said that just having the mere presence of him would deter violent men from attacking the women. Many of the sex workers offered him business, but no one really thought that he would say yes, as he would always blush and say some scripture. It would come as a surprise when offered one day, Earle would say yes. Even when she told Earle her price, which she quoted as more than she even thought she would make in a day, Earle still accepted. Earle would lose his virginity to an older sex worker in the back room of a brothel. It was said that the woman wept through his thrusts. Even after he ejaculated, he just kept going and going with rough treatment. The woman never thought in a million years that he would come back. She figured that he would be just too full of shame, but she was wrong. Earle already felt shame all of his life for looking at pretty girls, touching himself, and many other things, that he felt no difference between the shame of having sex with the shame that he should feel for strangling a sex worker with his bare hands. It was a feeling that he was used to, and he didn't seem to mind in the least. Although Lillian had been giving him an allowance, he hardly ever touched it, giving him a savings of sort. When he finally came to get a little bit, still leaving a huge amount, he didn't mind cheap whiskey or the ugliest, sickliest, or most elderly sex workers. They were cheaper. Unfortunately, for Earle, it would be one of the sex workers who would notice the oozing sores on his genitals that would put a stop to the sex workers, as no one wanted a man who was sick with what we know now was an STI, but because Earle was instilled with shame, he was scared to get medical help. Now, as the city grew boring for Earle, instead of being gone for just a few days here and there at his aunt's house, he would be gone for weeks because he would go on the road, which was actually a relief to his aunt and her husband. Although Earle did turn over whatever money he was able to scrape up for his room and board, and while Aunt Lillian and her husband did need the extra income, what it came with, life with Earle, was straining for the young couple starting a family of their own. No one really thought that Earle would get into any real trouble or be harmed in any real ways. He was too big. Lillian had long given up disciplining her mentally ill nephew as she had less time because she was trying to raise her own children. He took care of himself with his huge, hulking stature at such a young age. Earle loved to hop trains. In fact, because it was so easy for him, this was the best way to get around. However, he always stayed at this time in the state of California. His first brush with the law would soon come as Earle was still in the habit of breaking and entering into unused cabins to rest his head. Unfortunately for Earle, one of the cabins he broke into was occupied. Earle had finally wandered outside of California into a place called Plumas County, Sierra Nevada. As Earle, the filthy, large, and scary hobo of a man, came into the cabin, he was held at gunpoint until officers came and took him away. During court for this, the judge thought that Earle was being disrespectful, unable to keep himself from muttering things under his breath, and because of this, he was sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin. And this was the summer of 1915, while Earle was merely 18 years old. Although Earle was a soft-spoken man, he was huge in stature and therefore usually left alone in prison. As a bonus, the prison treated him for venereal diseases, but unfortunately for everyone else, Earle was still known for being the compulsive masturbator he had always been. Yikes. Due to overcrowding, Earle only had to spend a year in prison. When the parole board took one look at this mumbling, Bible-quoting oaf, they thought that he was mentally ill and were all too happy to release him. Aunt Lillian would now not allow him in her home as he was now a criminal and no longer a bumbling young man who needed help. Due to the nest egg that his Aunt Lillian had given him when he was set off, and the fact that he had learned some professional crime while in prison, Earle was not poor. He would still break in and enter the cabins, but instead of staying in them for the night and leaving, he would now take anything that he thought to be valuable and sleep inside the trains rather than stay the night at his crime scenes. He was getting used to sleeping during the day as he hated the sunlight anyways. It wouldn't be long before he was caught breaking into another place, this time a townhouse, and when he was taken away this time for trial, it was almost immediate. He was given 6 months for petty larceny, and that was said to be served out at the local jail instead of the prison this time. He was cut loose, and this time it was the middle of 1917. When Earle was released and now clean, he wanted to go back to his habit of finding sex workers but didn't want to go back to San Fran. So this time he went to LA. After the cost of his indictment, Earle was broke and didn't have enough money for a sex worker. Earle was arrested again the day after he got to LA for burglary, as this was the only way that he knew to get money. He was given a much harsher sentence and probably wouldn't be out of jail until the 1930s. Luckily for Earle, there was already a plan for a jailbreak from other inmates who would not have been successful without Earle's strength and build. He was able to tunnel out much faster than anyone else, and the group of inmates all parted ways after Earle had dug them out so quickly. Many young men were joining the military due to World War I, and it was the military that was now calling Earle's name as he had longed for the camaraderie, adventure, and smashing of the enemy, and after he knew the jail wasn't searching for him, he signed himself up for the military. Earle quickly became the most hated man in his unit as the men could not sleep with his constant muttering at night that he was known for and the long hours that he would spend awake in the showers after dark. The higher-ups in his unit saw the morale fading in Earle's presence, so they put him to work doing the shit that no one else wanted to, cleaning toilets and bathroom and digging, which didn't bother him in the least. He didn't care for hygiene. When the higher-ups realized that it was the time of doing nothing that bothered Earle the most and not the physical work, they used that against him to torment him. He was placed on the nightly guard duty, which was doing absolutely nothing for 8 hours each and every night. He finally had had enough and left in the middle of the night, abandoning his post and the military altogether. No one went looking for him. Not long after city hopping and again not being happy, it was now the Navy for Earle. He signed up and was shipped out quickly with the other recruits on the train. They took him right back to San Francisco, his old stomping grounds. Earle would find his menial tasks again boring as he didn't have the brain power to do the more difficult jobs. He again abandoned the military for the dark alleyways of San Francisco. For about 2 months, Earle roamed around the Bay Area until he realized burglarizing wasn't the same anymore. He re-enlisted with the Navy under a different name, and this time he was going to be a medical corpsman. After several months of this, he abandoned yet again, except this time he was caught, and when they interviewed him about abandoning again, he had said the burning about his anus was bothering him. The higher-ups knew about venereal diseases that were plaguing so many men in the military at this point, and instead of potentially being embarrassed by his behavior spreading around, they just cut him loose. In 1918, Earle joined the Navy once again, but as the state of his mental capacity was declining, he would just lay in his bunk all day and night reciting what was said to be the Book of Revelations. But this time, the military, instead of just cutting him loose again or beating the man into a different state, they attempted to finally get him some help for his mental health. This was a first for him, as he was finally able to be honest about what was going on in his mind and about his experiences in life. The Napa State Mental Hospital would find that Earle was riddled with many STDs, and they found out about his extremely heavy alcohol use that had only stopped a few months before he was in the hospital. He only stopped drinking because it no longer gave him relief from the pain in his head, and of course he still suffered from constant headaches and fainting when the pain was so strong. The doctors considered the source of all of Earle's problems to be the accident that messed with his head rather than his strict religious upbringing. However, I think now these thoughts would be different as we know much more about mental health. He never bothered staff as he was known to wander at all hours until one night he slipped out. But he was retrieved on the same grounds due to his rambling that could be heard from anywhere. They used medieval quote-unquote treatments that Earle would suffer without word until he again would escape due to this torment. This time they didn't go after him as they thought him to not be violent and definitely not homicidal. They were wrong. As Earle was roaming the streets of his old stomping grounds, he wandered around until he would run into his Aunt Lillian, who, at the time, was riddled with her own guilt of letting him leave the way that he did and wondering what was happening to him. Obviously, he had nowhere else to go, and although her husband was not happy about him being there, they both took pity on Earle and allowed him to stay. Although they had readied the guest room for him, the next day they would find Earle in the basement, darkness, curled up next to the furnace. He preferred it there. This is when Lillian would help Earle get set up with a job, to which he was reluctant, not wanting to run into any of the military branches. However, he was pleased when this job would be a janitorial position at a hospital called St. Mary's, and this was located on the outskirts of the city. Along with the job came a folded-out cot for him to stay on in the basement, which Earle always liked. Rekindling his relationship with his aunt would help stabilize Earle a bit and keep him from fleeing the area. While he was working at St. Mary's, his ears would be filled with the first sounds of laughter from a woman that would end up being his wife one day. Mary was a 58-year-old woman who had spent most of her adult life working at the hospital, living a simple life full of simple things that brought her joy. When Earle started at first paying attention to her, or going out of his way to run into her, she didn't really think that he was interested because she was old enough to be his mother, until she finally realized her age didn't seem to bother Earle. One day, she asked him if he wanted to join her for coffee down in the hospital cafeteria, and as she sat there taking in this hulking man, she realized that he could probably have a good choice of women his own age if he could just talk to them, but he wanted to talk to her. When the relationship finally became a dating scene for the pair, it was known that Mary was a very devout Catholic, and any type of serious physical relationship would not be acceptable until she was married. Earle now was going by the name of Evan, and was ever the gentleman to her, and was known to apologize if he ever made her uncomfortable. Within just a few months, the pair started talking about marriage, and as Mary spent a long time thinking over the facts that they could never have any children, she would obviously die before him, trying to come up with all the excuses of why they should not be together. None of them seemed to matter with how much Earle loved Mary. They eventually had a Catholic ceremony, as Earle was quite open to all religious experiences, and once the ceremony was over, Earle would carry his new bride over the threshold. The first night of marriage, Earle and Mary would engage in their first sexual experience together, where Earle would treat Mary like a sex worker, doing whatever he wanted with her body, and I guess Mary was just stunned and too embarrassed to object to anything he did. The next day, Earle softly kissed her cheek, and was his soft-spoken and sweet self again. As Mary was not experienced enough, having been a virgin, she had nothing to compare this rough experience to, and thought maybe this is just how it was for all women. It was said that Earle may have seen Mary as a mother as well as a wife, never raising a hand to her. However, he was filled with rage when he would see Mary talking to any stranger he didn't know, to the point where he would punch holes in the wall. When Mary would turn down Earle's advances, needing a break, he would lay there next to her, masturbating like a huge beast. As their marriage went on like this for months, Earle's headaches had returned, and one day while he was working at the hospital, Earle fell from a ladder and smacked his head again. This time, he was in a coma for 3 days. Whatever happened inside of his head, this man that had come home with Mary was not the same man that she had fallen in love with and married. It was said that all of his religious mania was now in the front of his personality, constantly raving to Mary that this was the world's end times, like the book of Revelations. Earle was starting to slip, as he would call himself Earle, now not Evan, and Mary took this as him forgetting his own name. Eventually, the marriage was in shambles, and Earle would return home at night smelling of sex and moonshine, and Mary was too afraid to confront him, yet her religious upbringing would not allow a divorce. She was just going through the motions, glad when Earle didn't come home some nights. Finally, when Earle wouldn't come home for a few weeks at a time, Mary did the unthinkable and filed for divorce. It was clear that the second blow to Earle's head had undid all of the quote-unquote work that he had done for himself, and he was right back to the religious maniac that he once was, as angels and demons once again whispered into Earle's ears. He truly believed that the opportunities that were presenting themselves to Earle was all part of God's plan. When Earle knocked on the door of a family named the Summers, Charles Jr. opened the door and Earle told the teen that he was a plumber and needed to go to the basement. The boy, not caring much, let him in and went back to whatever he was doing, not having or questioning anything that a man would show up and need to fix their boiler. Why else would he be there in those clothes if not to fix it? Earle found his way to the basement where he liked it, alone and dark. When the 12-year-old daughter of the Summers started down the stairs to the basement as she could hear someone mumbling in the darkness and she wanted to see who it was, she had no idea what she was about to encounter. She saw the giant downstairs, not knowing who he was and not understanding what was happening as the beastly man grabbed her ankles and drug her into the looming darkness. She was an innocent little girl who didn't understand why he was trying to paw off her clothing. All she knew was that the stranger was trying to touch her in places he shouldn't. Confused little Mary let out a loud scream. Earle, trying to cover her mouth as he tried to take his clothes off, must not have realized that her brother would hear her. Her brother came running down the stairs before Earle could do the worst part of what he was trying to do to this little girl. Charles knew what this sick fuck was trying to do to his little sister, as he told his sister to get the police while she was still trying to pull down her skirt, and of course, she was crying. Earle snapped out of it, as he was in the headspace that what he was about to do to little Mary was destined, and now he tried to make a run for it. Charles punched Earle in the stomach and proceeded to kick, shove, and continue hitting Earle. Well deserved. When Mary was able to run out into the street screaming for help, all of her neighbors just thought it was children playing. I can't even tell you guys how many times I have yelled into the backyard for my kids not to scream or yell, and I swear to you, I have told them so many times that if they do that, then one day, if they need help, people are just going to assume that they're playing. And then I read this. I felt justified in this moment for always having told my children this, as they probably thought that I was just the overprotective mom. As Charles joined his sister in screaming outside, as all three were now in the street, everyone came out, looking at them. As Earle tried to run, Charles held his shirt and didn't want him to be free to do this again. When Earle's panic finally allowed him to fight back, he hit Charles. Only once, but being the huge man that he was, this sent Charles flying, and apparently this knocked him out. The neighbors ran to shield Mary as Earle fled. In the fight with Charles, Earle had scratches all over, and his boiler outfit was torn, and a sleeve was actually gone, which didn't take the police long to find Earle the next day, although Earle had spent the entire night talking to people who weren't there, angry that the voices had lied to him, that this was his destiny. For whatever reason, probably mental illness, Earle grabbed angrily and plucked out every hair from his eyebrows. So when the judge saw Earle the next day, the judge found him to not be competent, and Earle was again hauled off to the hospital for assessment. When his wife Mary came to see the man the final time that she would encounter him, she didn't even recognize him, and because his eyebrows had been taken out hair by hair, the hospital had kept him in a straitjacket. Mary was his advocate at this point. As upset as she was to see him in this state and find out what he was, she felt this was because of mental health and not because he was a criminal, and she told the court as much. Earle was then committed back to the Napa State Hospital, where before they thought him as a gentle giant and nothing of violent, now he was dangerous and had violent tendencies. They thought him to be a danger to himself and others and noted that he was back and forth on the spectrum of extreme behaviors. The hospital had diagnosed Earle as being psychotic during all of this, and to top it off, they added that he had quote-unquote nomadic dementia. Psychiatrists would write on court documents that Earle was, quote, apathetic, eccentric, noisy, destructive, and incendiary, end quote. In case anyone doesn't know, because I didn't, incendiary means someone who is an agitator and is eager about fights and is rebellious. Although Earle wanted to escape, this time around he was under strict supervision. He had to be with restraints anytime he roamed the property, as well as being treated the first year daily with something called salvarsan. That would be an anti-syphilis drug, and this would actually be known to help his manic outbursts. At this time, Earle had settled and wasn't talking all the time about escaping. As they let him do little tasks around the hospital to keep him busy, Earle seemed to be recovering nicely. That is, until one day he wasn't, and he refused treatment and again spoke of escaping constantly. On November 2nd, 1923, Earle would escape the Napa hospital, and the hospital staff had absolutely no idea where he went or how he went. In San Francisco, Aunt Lillian was about to take her kids up to bed when they would see her nephew standing outside. She had heard that he was divorced and about him being in jail or the hospital, and felt that it was probably the best thing for him, really. Lillian and her children saw Earle outside with a face that was said to be comparable to a madman, as it terrified her children and even Lillian a little. But for whatever reason, she let him in. She allowed Earle to take one of her husband's suits, but convinced him that it would not be safe for him to stay there, and Earle agreed. Lillian didn't dare to hug or embrace her nephew, as the once gentle giant was now completely gone, and in its place stood the dangerous, scary man that she may not have wanted to see. She would later tell newspapers, quote, his eyes were just black, glaring at me, and the children rushed up to me, and of course I opened the door, because he was my own flesh and kin. I loved him, end quote. I'm not judging Lillian here by any means. She did what she felt was right, but I have to say that regardless of if the fact that I share blood with someone or not, personally, I don't feel obligated to put myself, and especially my children, in any danger to help a family member. Maybe it's because my own family is so messed up. I just wasn't raised with the whole, you do for family thing. So much of my family is estranged and toxic, so maybe if it's instilled in you, then you do those things. But if myself or my children were afraid of someone staring into the window in the darkness, I will talk to you through the door or the window, but your ass is not coming into my house. Sorry, not sorry. When Earle left with the suit, Lillian called the police and then the hospital to tell them where Earle was and now the new clothes that he would be in. This time, at the hospital, he was treated like the man everyone thought he was. After about 16 months, he would then be released, this being 4 years since the attack on Little Mary. This would be the beginning of Earle's killing spree. Earle went to look at a room on February 20th, 1926 in a boarding house that had a room for rent sign in it. As Clara Newman was cooking herself lunch, she heard a knock at the front door, and as this 60-year-old fragile woman stopped cooking, she opened the door. Claire was said to be a woman who, although her age may have been a little older, was still sharp as a tack and had a no-shenanigans type of attitude. She apparently owned numerous boarding houses, which she was strict about. No sailors or men of drink were allowed to stay. Earle introduced himself with a soft-spoken tone and asked about the room, and after speaking a little bit about himself, Clara would notice this nicely dressed man, Bible in hand, reciting passages from the good book, as charming. She decided to let him see the room for rent. Now, it was said that normally Claire's residents were older widowers, as she herself lived in this particular boarding house as well, and had that no-nonsense type of attitude. She, however, was completely fooled with Earle's soft mannerisms and show of utter respect to her while showing absolutely no aggression. Earle didn't have a thought of anyone else who could be in the large house. Instead, he swiftly grabbed Clara by the throat, not so much as letting air escape this poor older woman. He made sure this time his victim would not have the chance to scream or alert anyone else. And with the giant hands and strength he had, this was an easy task. Earle brought her to the ground. He knew that even an unconscious body would still serve its purpose to Earle's lusts. Realizing that other people could hear or come out now and see him, and remembering his last escape from the group of people, it was stated in Guerrilla Killer that Earle picked up Clara by her neck and carried her that way to the empty room. Taking Clara's body into the closet, Earle pushed up Clara's clothing and had, like the beast he was, raped her dead body like an animal. Once he was finished, he cleaned himself up and was headed out the front door when he heard someone ask if they could help him. To this, Earle didn't even turn around to see who it was or show his face. He simply told the stranger to let the landlady know that he would be back in an hour and that he wished to rent the room. The person turned out to be Clara's nephew, who noticed her missing from her usual place in the kitchen and was confused as ever when he went to search for her and noticed a half-cooked lunch. After Clara's nephew, Morton, was finished working for the day, he came back downstairs to ask his aunt about the man that he had seen earlier, only to find that the kitchen was in the exact same state. As his wife and children returned to the house after seeing a movie, everyone went to search for Aunt Clara when they stumbled upon her graying, cold body as she was spread eagle in that closet. As the newspaper detailed the crimes after the police had come, they left out the part about the necrophilia. In Earle's head, this was God's will. If God hadn't wanted Clara to die, then he wouldn't have allowed her to open the door to Earle. God wanted Earle to kill people. He gave him the strength, the lusts, and he kept Earle out of the lights of others to continue his work. 2 weeks later, he felt compelled to leave San Francisco and travel to San Jose. It wasn't long before he felt the urge from God, and on March 2nd, he was again looking at another room for rent sign. When Laura Beale, a woman of 63 years, came to the door, Earle was able to lie much easier this time, as this would be his routine. Unable this time to get his hand under her chin and around her throat, he used her house robe belt, made of silk, as a ligature and strangled her to death. And as he didn't just use his hands this time, it was even easier. He pulled so hard on the silk rope that it cut through her skin and blood started gushing out with the beat of her heart. After she stopped struggling and was clearly dead, Earle did not feel shamed or any guilt, as no one was there to judge him anymore. As he saw it, Grandma, or in this case Laura, wouldn't be able to cast him into the darkness for his sins, as he could use her body as a doll and do and pose her as he pleased. Unfortunately, when Laura's husband got home from work that day, as he was a real estate agent, he couldn't find his wife, which was puzzling for him as she was always home. Searching the building full of apartments, it wasn't until the very end of the search that the empty apartment was searched, and the elderly woman who went into the room and saw Laura actually passed out. And while Laura's husband went to catch her, he saw his own wife and was no longer able to catch the fainting woman as they both fell together. A neighbor got the police, where the authorities were able to tell that another rape of a dead body had occurred on poor Laura. They were able to link this death immediately to Clara's as well. The only sighting of Earle was from Laura's nephew and another witness from the first murder, as a large, dark man, and that of a sallow-faced man. So I had to look up what sallow meant because I wasn't familiar, and it was defined as a pale or yellow-tinged complexion that can indicate the person is in poor health, has an underlying medical condition, or is looking fatigued and tired. After the second murder, Earle hopped on the train that took him back to San Francisco, all the while allowing what he thought to be God to lead his feet. As rumors of the Dark Strangler were circulating in the papers, it apparently had gotten to the point where there were cartoons drawn of his figure in the media, mostly newspapers, where they would depict Earle as a sallow-faced man who walked on his knuckles, and it had kind of become a joke by the time the ordeals had passed and the media moved on. At the end of March 1928, Earle would be looking for another room to rent. And that, my friends, is where we are going to leave off for part 1 of the Gorilla Killer. When I first started my research and book reading for this case, I actually had no idea that it was going to end up 2 parts, but after scripting everything out, it ended up being way too long for 1 episode. There was just so much information out there about Earle Nelson, and I really wanted to give you guys a sense of who Earle was and his background, because I find that stuff so fascinating, trying to figure out why people are the way they are. It doesn't excuse any of the behavior by any means, but I like to find the patterns in how people were raised or things that happened to them when they were young that explains some of their behavior later on, especially because of his strict religious background and obviously his gnarly head injury. So next week's episode is going to cover all of his murders, which, fair warning, are going to be graphic, brutal, and very sexual. So I hope that you guys come on back next week and we will finish up the Gorilla Killer, aka the Dark Strangler, aka Earle Nelson. Don't forget to follow us on social media to see extra pictures of the cases each week. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.